As Brad mentioned, this is always an interesting time between Christmas and New Year's. And when I've gotten together with some friends after Christmas Day, we start talking about the initial greetings and talk about what's been going on, quite often they say, "Oh, man, that meal, I think I ate too much." So let's just poll the room here. Lift your hand if you think you or the person beside you ate too much this Christmas. Go ahead and put up your hand. Okay, so vast majority of us. That usually seems to be the thing. Part of a Christmas tradition is a meal together, where family or friends or both come together and we share a big meal as a celebration of Jesus coming to us. And even those who are not Christians often come together for a big meal as a celebration. And then with the meal, when you have family and friends around the table and people are eating and drinking and they're having fun together, we share stories. We joke, we tease, we ask questions, we get to know and learn more about and get caught up about each other's lives. But we all know there's one rule. We've been taught this rule from a young age. This rule governs not just meals at Christmas, but meals at church functions, social settings, family gatherings. This rule is for our own good, we are taught. This rule is designed to prevent fights, conflicts, and all appearances of discomfort. The rule is simple. Do not talk about politics or religion. We feel that it is rude, it is tacky, it will ruin Christmas if we talk about those subjects. And often when they have come up, the conversation's been divisive. That we start to question the sanity and the intellect of the people across from us. Sometimes we feel embarrassed. The strong personalities in the group say, "Well, I embrace conflict and I want to tell it like it is." And those that avoid or tend to avoid conflict cringe from the conflict and say, "Please just shut up." The reality is we disagree about all kinds of things as human beings, as people who are made in the image of God, but God has crafted us as unique beings with unique experiences, places that we've lived, statuses. Ask any husband and wife, do you agree? Well, in the first year of marriage, they might say, "Oh, we agree about everything." And on the rest of who are married, just say, "Just wait. Just wait." Talk to a parent and a child, and you'll see disagreement. Talk to a boss and employee, you will see disagreement. Ever try to talk to a toddler, and you will see disagreement. But one of the heartaches in my life is seeing churches and Christians and church groups torn apart, not by disagreement, but how they handled the disagreements. There was a young adult group that I was leading when I was in college, and we changed up how we did baptism a little bit. And I thought I'd be innovative and try to look at the early church and how they practiced, communion. And we wanted to change up communion and do it a little bit differently. And so we did it at night on a Sunday. And we changed up a few things at how we did that. And I thought, this would be such an intimate, positive, expanding experience where we would experience the presence of Christ as we look to each other face to face around this intimate setting in a living room. Well, that experience went over like a lead balloon. There were tears. I think people walked out of the room partway through. It was not the positive experience I'd hoped for. And in the weeks that followed, obviously there was disagreement. And so I thought, as a young Bible college student, that, well, what's the best thing you do? Let's look to the Bible. Surely if we read the Bible together, the same passages together, we would come to an agreement. We would understand that what I was doing was a good thing. And so I told everyone, here are the Bible passages, look them up, let's get together. We got together in this big room. I think there was about 25 of us. And for an hour, we read and shared and sometimes yelled and cried. And we were angry with each other. We didn't handle our differences too well. And it split the group. It wasn't until years later that I had a friend of mine write to me, and he said, I'm actually in a class talking about communion, and I just remember about our experience. And for my part, I wanted to apologize for how I handled things. A number of weeks ago, I was talking with my daughters, and I was trying to think of what would be a good topic this time of year. And one of them said, with the conversations that I'm a part of, Dad, quite often the people that I run into, they say, well, if you have the same Messiah, the same Savior, that is Jesus, you follow the same Jesus, and you have the same Bible, why is it that Christians disagree so much? What is up with that? And I thought, it might be an interesting conversation, because then I thought about Christmas dinner and the rule that you don't talk about religion and politics, because when you do, it usually goes poorly. But the thing is that when we get to know each other, when we spend time in building relationships, important topics shouldn't be taboo. We should be able to have the maturity or the grace or the character to be able to handle important topics like religion, politics, and other things. Well, why is it that we disagree? Well, some of the topics that we do disagree with when it comes to religion would be the role of baptism, women in leadership, same-sex relationships in the church, creation and evolution, the role of politics in the church, Calvinism versus Arminianism. And if you don't understand those or know those titles, don't worry about it. You're blessed because you don't know. And I think sometimes we disagree, and we could probably come up with the same list, that sometimes we're selfish. Sometimes we have, as I said, different experiences. We have different intellect. I remember having a conversation with someone years ago about a particular religious topic, and this person said, well, my father is a pastor for all my life, and he taught me these things. And so are you telling me that my pastor dad is wrong? How do you argue against that? When we think about disagreements, sometimes we start to get emotionally invested and say, if you're disagreeing with me, are you saying that I'm dumb? That it's a judgment call on my intelligence? A number of years ago, I started reading a book called How to Read a Book by Mortimer Adler and Charles Van Doren. And this book's a classic book for academics. And they said that if you're going to argue against someone, you have to argue on 4 grounds or in 4 different areas. So if you're arguing against someone and you're pushing against their idea, you have to establish that maybe their argument is uninformed. Or maybe that their argument is misinformed. Or maybe that their argument is illogical. Or that their argument's analysis is somehow incomplete. So uninformed, misinformed, illogical, or incomplete. And I thought, that's pretty good. If we follow that rubric, I can point out the errors, fix them, and we'll all be back on track agreeing with me. But that doesn't happen, does it? Even when you've tried to point out the fallacies in the other person's argument, it usually doesn't go well, does it? But don't you wish it was different? Don't you wish that you could have an enriching, positive conversation around a dinner table with people that see differently from you, that have different opinions, and it still be mutually beneficial? That even within the church, that there would be less tension when we came to contentious topics. I think there's a way. And I don't have any naivete to believe that what I'm going to share with you will solve all of our future conversations. But I do feel like the Bible gives some insight and some reflection on having helpful and healthy arguments and conversations around contentious topics. Now, it used to be, and maybe you still feel, some people feel this way, that you appeal to a common standard or a higher standard than yourself. And so let's say if you're Catholic, you could say, well, you got to talk to the Pope, or what does the Pope say? Or what does the historical precedent in the church establish? That's the standard. Well, if you're a Protestant, maybe you might say, well, what does our denomination say? Or what do the elders and the lead pastors say on this subject? That is kind of the standard. But I think it betrays a practical problem. And then the problem is that we don't always agree with our elders, pastors, denominations, the Pope, and history. And so it's simply appealing to them doesn't help ourselves. And I think that's fair. I think that we can't just simply opt out of thinking through issues to someone else, to another organization. That I think it's important. It's a learning opportunity that God has given us to learn about it and engage for ourselves on given topics. But I do feel like if there is one standard that at least as Christians can appeal to, it's the Bible. And I don't say that just to be simplistic or naive, but the Bible has to be a common standard. That if we don't have that a common standard, it's very hard to negotiate differences. But it can be done. But on theological topics, I think the Bible needs to be the standard. And when we talk about the Bible, here are some kind of foundational, I think, statements or things that we have to hold to when we talk about appealing to the Bible. That first off, God's ways expressed through the Bible should bring us towards relationships and protection. So as we're talking about something and we're putting a group of people or an individual in a state where they are less protected, that they are we're setting them up to being open to being abused or taken advantage of, then I think we might be off a little bit. Or as we're talking about God's ways and divisions start to multiply, then I think maybe we're missing the point. So God's ways should bring us towards relationships and protection within the church. It should also bring us towards greater love. That is, if I'm arguing or having a conversation about a particular topic and I'm feeling less loving towards that person across from me, then I'm missing the point. Or I'm missing a biblical foundation. That God's ways should bring us towards greater love. Third thing is that it should foster a greater sense of God's holiness. So we talk about God's love, and sometimes that could slip into kind of a casual and superficial sort of love. And so I make the statement that it should also lead us to a deeper or greater sense of God's holiness. And in the midst of that, it should fit into God's grace. As we're talking about things, how does this fit into God's grace? I remember the conversation we had about women in leadership. We took a long time as a church and as elders over this topic. And we had people with different positions, not even different camps, but all kinds of different positions. And in the midst of it, I know that the leadership's goal was that how does this fit into fostering relationships, to protect people, to foster a greater sense of love, greater sense of God's holiness, fit into God's grace. So whatever we decide, we're holding up this idea that we're stepping forth in God's grace on this, and then ultimately that it should seek unity. Not necessarily uniformity or conformity, but unity. So how can we be united as a group on this particular topic? And I think these are great sort of principles when you're having that Christmas dinner conversation on contentious issues. Interesting thing is that the Bible is full of conflict within God's people. We don't have to turn too far. We think, well, maybe it's just the Old Testament. It's throughout the New Testament. I think of Jesus and the Pharisees. It was ongoing conflict. And they disagreed on fundamental issues, such so that the Pharisees sought to have Jesus crucified. And then as a church is established, we have two people that have a contentious issue. Paul and this guy named John Mark, who incidentally wrote the Gospel of Mark. They part ways. Paul wants nothing to do with John Mark, as they are both sharing the gospel and spreading it. Just before that story in the book of Acts, chapter 15, we have a situation where the church is growing and a number of non-Jews are starting to come to the faith, and the existing Christians who are Jews already, they grew up in Judaism, and within that cultural framework, basically saw these new people coming in as saying, you have to become like us. You have to take on the forms of Judaism to be a Christian. And so they're insisting on things like circumcision. Not a comfortable topic to talk about, but that was the reality, and that was the issue in Acts chapter 15. And so what do they do? Because this was going to split the church. In fact, if you look at all what we call the epistles, all the letters, so the book of James, all the writings of Paul, 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, all these epistles are not just simply establishing theological principles. They are essentially written to address conflict in the church. Theological conflict is usually what it is. And so I often call them occasional writings, that they're written to address an occasion, a situation that was coming up in the church. So each one of these epistles is speaking to conflict, theological disagreement. And then it doesn't stop after the church is established. We've just celebrated Christmas. Interesting story about St. Nicholas, who is kind of the early form of the Santa Claus that shows up. One of the first Christian leadership councils, where all these Christian leaders from the known world got together under Emperor Constantine in 325. They had to get together to solve some major theological differences on the nature of Jesus. Who is Jesus? And some of the delegates, led by a man named Arius, said that Jesus is just a man. He's not God, he's just a man. And then there are others that disagreed. And as Arius is sharing his position and getting really into it, St. Nicholas, or Nicholas, Bishop Nicholas of Myra, was so incensed by what he was hearing, he walked up and he slapped Arius on the face. So the next time you see Santa Claus, you can picture what was going on with St. Nicholas at the Council of Nicaea. This was such a serious thing that he was brought before the emperor, because you were not allowed to incite violence or enact violence on anyone in the presence of the emperor. Nicholas could be killed. And so Emperor Constantine convened, and he said, well, this is a council, and so I'll let the bishops decide what will happen to Nicholas. So he actually was sent to prison for slapping Arius on the face because he disagreed with him so much. Now he did repent, and they let him out of prison and reestablished him himself as a bishop. But that was the Council of Nicaea in 325. And then in 1054, the thing that rocked the Christian world is the church that was essentially one, more or less, split into what we have the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. They call it the Great Schism. There's a disagreement over the Holy Spirit's relationship with the Son, or at least that's what the hook that everyone blamed it on. Within the Catholic Church, we had another major split. In 1517, the Protestant Reformation started, with Martin Luther pegging his 95 thesis to the Wittenberg door, establishing a new split, theological split. And then, I'm not Mormon, obviously, but I always found it quite interesting. In 1820, Joseph Smith, the founder of the Latter-day Saints movement and the Mormons that they're most frequently called, asked this question when he was 15 years old. He said, if there are so many churches that all disagree with each other, which one is right? Which one should I follow? And he said that he had a vision of two persons, and they basically said, they're all wrong. I want you to start your own church. Now, as I said, I disagree with Joseph Smith's conclusion, but his observation was very accurate. That during this time, there were an incredible number of theological divisions going on within God's church. So what I want to propose are 6 postures, 6, I think, healthy postures that we could have when we are having a disagreement. And these are kind of like scenarios. The first one is right and the other was wrong. Now, this is the most common one, and sometimes it's true. If we think about Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus wasn't wrong when he was debating or pushing back against the Pharisees' teachings. In fact, even Paul warns this young pastor, Timothy, in the second letter to him, saying, and this is in chapter 4, a time is coming when people will no longer listen to sound and wholesome teaching. They're going to follow their own desires, and they'll look for teachers who will tell them whatever their itching ears want to hear. So it is a fair scenario that sometimes one person's right and another person is wrong. I think it's a current cultural myth to say that all perspectives are valid, that there's even some truth in everything. I think what this position, this posture, helps us do is to hold each other to a concept of truth and proper interpretation, proper study. And the interesting thing is sometimes as we go through and hold on to this posture, we might realize that I'm the wrong one and the other person is correct. And so I think we need to be, if we have this posture, being open to the idea that we might be the wrong one. Because the reality is that when we read the Bible, as we talk about the Bible, as we share about the Bible, our perspectives have a huge impact. That people's life can hang in the balance if we're right, if we're accurate, if we're truthful. Or people can die, and people have died because of being wrong. So that's one posture. The second, not to contradict what I just said, but maybe both are right. Maybe there is an element of truth on both sides. Or maybe both are wrong. And we need to keep talking. And I think with this posture, what it is it challenges us to have this position, this attitude of humility. To realize that I see in part and I know in part. I don't have all the facts. I maybe lack in understanding. I might use faulty reasoning and logic. I think this is where the proverb comes in handy. Proverbs 27, verse 17 is iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens the other. Two people rubbing together in a discussion, I think if it's charitable and respectful, can sharpen one another. If it's done in humility, say, hey, we might both be wrong or we might both be right, but how can we sharpen each other? That this is a helpful posture. The third posture is to simply say it matters not. Yeah, we're having this discussion, but really it's not that big of a deal. How can I say that? I remember saying that years ago, and I said that there's some things that are really important in the Bible, and there's some that are really not that important if we disagree on. And this person pushed back and said, no, I think everything's important. Well, let's appeal to a different standard. Let's appeal to the Bible. And Paul, writing to Timothy in his first letter, he says to Timothy, guard what God has entrusted to you. So avoid godless, foolish discussions with those who oppose you, with their so-called knowledge. Paul recognizes that there are going to be discussions in the church that are really not that fruitful, not that important. We have to recognize that sometimes it matters not. But sometimes it matters too much. That what we're talking about is too important. Now, I may not recommend to go to the extent of Bishop Nicholas and slap the person across the table who disagrees with us, but to simply remain silent on a topic is wrong. Paul couldn't stay silent on the topic of how the church was to accept Gentiles into Christianity. To impose all these Jewish regulations upon them, to make barriers for them, he just felt like that's missing the point of the gospel, and he could not be silent. And so the text has some strong language. So in Acts 15, verse 1, while Paul and Barnabas were in Antioch in Syria, some of the men from Judea arrived and began to teach the believers, unless you are circumcised as required by the law of Moses, you cannot be saved. Paul and Barnabas disagreed with them, arguing vehemently, strongly, intensely, because it mattered too much. The people's lives were at stake, and they couldn't be silent. The next position, it really matters, and I still respect you. That even though this topic really matters and we disagree, I still respect you. And I think that's an important posture. And I saw that happening, again, back when we were talking about women in leadership at this church, which pretty much every church, no matter where they're at, wrestles with this topic. And it's an important topic. But at the end of the day, how do we respect one another? In fact, I think that you could be right on something and still be wrong. You could be correct and accurate, but you're still wrong. I want to say my wife proves that to me regularly when I am accurate on something and she's like, oh man, you really are not. She would say, no, you're wrong on both accounts. But how we act, how we respect, how we love is as important as being correct. How the early church got together and sorted through this contentious issue was so important. It's not just how they did it, it's not just about what they came up with as a conclusion, it's how they came together. And there was respect, there was they were candid with each other, they debated things, they sorted through things, but they came together in unity. And here's the last posture that I think is important, that sometimes we have to embrace this. We're just not ready to talk about it. There are certain subjects and certain times that, you know what, this is not the right time. I'm a night person. My wife is a morning person. I love to talk about all kinds of things, heavy things, especially late at night. I think, my mind really starts to wake up at about 11 p.m. My wife's mind is asleep by 10:30. So if we're lying next to each other in bed and we're getting close to that 10:30 mark and my mind is starting to wake up and I'm like, so, let's talk about finances. Let's talk about your family or my family. Let's talk about this particular theological issue. I know for a fact it will not go well. And she's told me this. She just, right off, now she just says, okay, whoa, whoa, whoa. Know what time it is? Not a good time. We're not ready to talk about it. Sometimes we are invested in a too personal sort of way, where identity or our value, or the sense of historical loyalty is all wrapped up on a particular position. And we're so close to it that we can't differentiate between the idea and ourselves. And I don't think we're ready to talk about it when that happens. In fact, I think a lot of our disagreements are not propositional, but they're rather emotional. And I would say that it's not just, some guys go, oh yeah, the women and I know in my life, definitely way too emotional. I'm like, dude, you are really emotional. Lots of guys are hugely emotional, even though they tend to deny it and try to be really stoic about things. You just got to flip a mirror on them so they can see it for themselves. Their voice gets louder. They become a lot more staccato in their speaking. Become too emotional. And what do we do in this sort of situation? I think that we should practice the fruits of the Spirit. Paul writes in Galatians 5:22, the fruits of the Spirit is love, is joy, peace and patience, kindness and goodness, faithfulness and gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. That when we can't talk about something, we step into the fruits of the Spirit. I want to encourage you not to avoid contentious issues, not to run away from, but pick one of these postures and use discernment and to step into those, because if you run away, you'll miss a great opportunity for a deeper relationship, for growth on your own part. So practice grace and humility. Exercise empathy and maybe some understanding of asking, okay, tell me more about that. Be curious. Ask the why questions. Why do you believe that? Help me understand that better. I think there is a place for boundaries. That there's certain people that when we talk to, it's not easy to talk to and they're just toxic. And so put some boundaries. I think there's a place for honesty. Saying, I really believe this. This is why. Not that long ago, I had someone come into my office and we wanted to talk about baptism. This person had a different perspective than I do on baptism. And sometimes when someone meets with the pastor, it can be a difficult conversation. Both parties are a little bit like holding their breath. But quite frankly, I enjoy these sorts of conversations. I see them as wonderful gifts from God. And this example was no different. And we talked, and I really appreciated his posture. He had thought through things, and he had reread through things. He brought things up, but he also asked, okay, tell me more. Tell me why. Help me understand more. And at the end of the day, we agreed on some stuff that maybe we didn't realize that we had beforehand. And we disagreed on some others. But we had a lot more clarity. There was a deep level of respect. And we both felt like we left feeling closer together and that we grew because of it. Dream with me what it would be like if you had Christmas tabletop conversation where you could talk about these things. and the tension was gone. Not the disagreement, but the tension, the animosity, the anger, the lack of civility, that would be gone. Won't those be better meals? Won't you feel better as a person? We'd have stronger families, closer relationships. I think better churches, even churches that become a light into a world that needs to learn how to disagree well, because this world does not. And so I think God is giving us an opportunity to have better conversations with one another with these 6 postures.